All right, hello everybody. So welcome to Climate Change from Anxiety to Action. If everybody looks at the screen, sorry, we're just waiting for some of our words to pop up. They're just taking a second, but I can see them over on my screen. And a few of the words we have are overwhelmed, confused, frustrated, none of which are surprising to me. But with that being said, I am so excited to welcome you all tonight. And I'm sure a lot of the topics that you guys entered into that link will be touched upon within the next hour. And before I hand it over to our moderator, I will take a second to introduce myself. So my name is Ariel Rodriguez, and I am one of the team members for tonight's event. I will be monitoring the chat box throughout the event. But with that being said, I'll hand it over to Noreen.
Hi everyone, my name is Noreen and I will be monitoring the chat box for today. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Eleanor and I will be helping coordinate the Q&A portion at the end of the event.
Hello everyone, my name is Shala.
I'm Curtis. I'm so sick interviewer. Just listen.
Okay, I think we lost connection a bit there with Sala. So, hello everyone. Thank you again for joining us tonight. Wait, I hear some feedback.
Can everybody go on mute when they're not speaking?
I would really appreciate if everybody click the mute on their computers. Good, I think we're good now. Thank you very much. So as I was saying, hello again, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for this event. My name is Javier and I'll be the moderator for today's evening. I'm really excited for you all to be here and to hear the insights of four wonderful speakers we have. On tonight's panel, we have Rebecca, we have Suzanne, we have Laura and Ali, who will all introduce themselves more in depth as the night goes on. Before we get started, I would also like to do a land acknowledgement. So Centennial College is proud to be part of a rich history of education in this province and in this city. We acknowledge that we are on the treaty lines and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and we pay tribute to their legacy and the legacy of all the First Peoples of Canada as we strengthen ties with the communities through learning. Today, the traditional meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work with the communities that have grown in the treaty lands of the Mississaugas. We acknowledge that we are all treaty people and accept our responsibility to honor our relations. I would also like to thank our sponsors for today's event: Environmental Defense in Toronto in Canada, Climate Psychology Alliance North America, and Global Warming Agency in Colombia. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our first speaker to the stage, Rebecca Weston. She's the co-president of the Climate Psychology Alliance North America.
Hi.
Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you everybody who is here, and thank you for inviting me for such an important topic, and I'm eager to hear what other people have to say, and I'm eager for the questions and for the whole program, so thank you so much. And just briefly, I am a co-president of the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America, which is a fairly new organization. It is 100% volunteer-based, and it is a mental health clinician-based organization that is focused on developing networks of clinicians around the United States and Canada who are climate aware and who can start providing mental health treatment and mental health suggestions and mental health information to journalists and to people experiencing the mental health impacts of climate change. And we are encouraging people to sign up if they like what they hear today. We need more of us all over the world, and certainly in the United States as well. So without further, I'll go on and sort of let you guys know sort of what we do and how I think of our field. Sort of within the mental health profession, come to think of it, within most professions, there are at least two lineages. There's one lineage that historically enabled or stood on the sidelines of bombs, destruction, norm enforcing, and racism, what Robert J. Lifton called malignant normality. And then there's another lineage that tells the story of human diversity, interconnection, care, and suffering. The witnesses, as Lifton called them. Witnesses hold stories, acknowledge difficult truths, find meaning, and seek to prevent and ease the pain that this world sends up. And to my mind, the field of climate psychology is a field of professional witnesses. And I mean this in many ways. First, we attest to the very real mental health impacts we witness arising from the concrete consequences of climate change, from drought, species loss, food scarcity, raging fires, chronic thirst, extreme heat, hurricanes, floods, homelessness, and displacement. Climate psychologists document the trauma, the rage, the grief, the fear, the helplessness, the insecurity, the depression, the erosion of trust, belonging, a sense of home, and a sense of community. We also call attention to the ways in which climate change amplifies systemic oppressions and existential crisis threats, those oppressions and threats that already existed in ways that helped create the very crisis of which we now speak. Indeed, the American Psychological Association and Eco-America have recently documented such impacts in their 2021 report. Second, climate psychologists witness and offer ways of understanding and relating to extremely disturbing and disorienting contradictions we are seeing playing out every day. For example, the questions that come up. If world leaders know our very survival, their children's survival is at stake, why are they not addressing it? How do they sleep at night? Are they in denial? Don't they have kids? Do they even care? Or am I the only one who cares, or am I just going crazy? Why does it still feel like business as usual? Or another one that comes up. How do I both hold the overwhelming reality of what is happening and still go on with the urgent demands and issues of my daily life? And finally, with our climate communication colleagues, we try to answer an urgent question. How do we tap people's sense of care and agency to take action? Do we offer more facts? Do we raise alarms? Do we offer hope? Do we point to progress and solutions? Or do we demonstrate how inadequate the political response still is? Third, and finally, climate psychologists witness and try to address not only the deep undercurrents of emotion that people are feeling in response to climate change more generally, but also the adaptive and maladaptive ways of responding to that emotion. And I mean that at the individual, community, and societal level. And it is in this third witnessing role that I'll spend the rest of my time. So let me delve into it a little bit further. All around the world, including in the United States and Canada, climate-related distress is on the rise, as we just saw in the word board. While it may not always present as climate anxiety, climate scientists, climate teachers, climate activists, and frontline communities have been holding this distress for many years. That is a reality deserving of its own panel conversation, and about which many have written. But as the slow violence of grinding environmental injustice dovetails with the traumatic realities of news coverage of extreme weather events, more and more people are waking up to the enormity of our crisis. More and more articles are appearing about climate anxiety, And more people are recognizing a range of feelings that accurately or inaccurately come under that label. As researchers in the field of climate communications found in September of this year, at least 70% of Americans are at least somewhat worried about global warming, and over 35% are very worried. In a second study released at the same time, a collection of international researchers found that globally, children and young people are particularly distressed. Large percentages of children and youth report that they feel their future is frightening, that they feel helpless, powerless, and angry. And around the world and in therapy offices, including my own, youth are reporting that climate distress is impacting not only their daily life, but also their larger choices around major life events, whether to go to college, whether to have children. So on the one hand, we witness a growing swell of anxiety and worry, globally and including in the United States and Canada. A swell of anxiety and worry that is not remotely pathological, but a response to a moral injury based in reality, in people caring about their loved ones, their lives, and their futures. But on the other hand, both studies highlight several additional key findings. First, even though a substantial majority of Americans in this study are worried about climate change, 61% of all Americans rarely or never talk about it. Think about that. On the subways, in the grocery stores, in our classrooms, or at work, the majority of people are silent about something that is causing them distress. In other words, as climate psychologist Renee Lertzman has argued, silence does not mean apathy. Something else is going on in the quiet, in the business as usual. And that's really important, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Also in the studies that documented youth experience of distress, researchers found two key relational aspects that require highlighting in this context. More than half of the youth surveyed felt dismissed when they shared their fears, and their distress is directly linked to the fact that no one is doing enough about it. Not the grown-ups, not the political leaders, not school administrators, not those who control the economic and political levers of society. Now, I work in the field of attachment and parenting, and I know that when adults are unable to tolerate their own feelings, they will not be able to hold, address, and provide solutions for those of their children. In the anxious silence around us, our youth, we all are suffering, and the crisis escalates. So what does this mean, this silence? Well, first and foremost, psychology is not a profession of silence. It is a profession of conversation, of surfacing, sharing, and exploring feelings and emotion. And as climate psychologists, we know that in the context of climate distress, silence about how one is feeling is not a good thing. It means that feelings are unsupported, unacknowledged, sequestered from human connection, and left dangling and isolated. And in this kind of silence, all manner of defenses kick in, and most of them are not helpful in addressing climate change. As climate psychologists, we witness a range of defenses. For example, we witness disavowal. That's an awareness that something is happening, but then a turning away. In a beautiful turn of phrase, one psychoanalyst called it the unthought known. We know, but we live as if we don't, or we live as if it won't affect us, as if it's far away, as if others will take care of it, others know more, as if we're exceptions. Overwhelmed or ashamed by the bigness of the problem and the vulnerable or perceived smallness of our own personhood, disavowal is a way of managing very, very uncomfortable feelings. When Hurricane Ida hit my region, immigrant families died from flooding in illegal basement apartments in New York City. And while I tried hard to see and to hold, I too psychologically turned away, relieved that just 15 miles north, the floods were not as deadly. Even close by, it was far away. But not only is far away getting closer and closer, but in turning away from feelings, we also turn away from what we care about most, each other, our sense of connection, our authenticity. And in cutting off those parts of ourselves, we get further away from addressing the problem. Second, we witness getting busy. An effort to push away the feelings through action, action, action. And by action, I do not mean productive, collaborative, and intentional action towards a stated goal of culture and policy change, but instead something feverish, self-punishing, highly moralistic, highly dependent on individualism. This kind of busyness is probably familiar to many activists. Despite having extremely sophisticated systemic analyses, and despite knowing that the problem is far bigger than themselves, many nevertheless manage very hard feelings from a place of guilt, perfectionism, purity, and vigilance. This defense looks like paralysis at the grocery store, late night cataloging of one's carbon sins, guilt that one can't single-handedly live outside the web of our fossil fuel economy. And finally, we know that silence can lead not only to disowning feelings, but to disowning people. And here I do not want to mince words. The stakes are very, very high as we witness authoritarian trends deepen around the globe. As we have all learned from this pandemic, itself related to ever-widening extractive industries, mass human insecurity and suffering does not necessarily generate collaboration, connection, or empathy. In an article that appeared in The Guardian a few weeks ago, just after COP26, journalist Oliver Millman reported that the far right is beginning to lean into this crisis, tapping the insecurity and directing it towards frontline victims of climate change through scapegoating, nativism, and harsh borders. In Arizona, the state attorney general used climate change as a reason to exclude immigrants. So that brings me full circle. First and foremost, climate psychologists witness and create room to talk, to safely break one's silence. And here I agree with Katharine Hayhoe, an exemplary climate communicator and scientist, who continues to say that the single most effective climate action we can take is to talk about it. So how do we do that? How do climate psychologists help break the silence? First, we offer what is called climate-aware therapy. In this kind of therapy, we break down the barrier between the office space and the external world. Mindful not to proselytize, we nevertheless assess for climate distress, we acknowledge the scale of the problem, and we explore the ways we each show up to this crisis with our own histories, experiences, relationship to privilege, and interpersonal dynamics. Focused on membership within my own organization of clinicians, it is truly an honor to hear the myriad ways in which witnessing professionals are becoming climate aware, creating programs, writing articles, forging spaces. We are small, but we are growing as we try to organize climate aware clinicians focused on care for activists, youth, teachers, parents, and so on. And second, we offer what we call climate cafes. Held safely by trauma-informed clinicians, these are small discussion circles of ordinary people living their lives in this crisis. Bringing up what is often not named, we give room to speak about existential fears, disbelief, worries about children, guilt, a sense of helplessness and confusion. Having led several cafes, I can attest. In becoming witnesses for each other, we feel we're not alone, we're not crazy, and that our neighbors do care. Invariably, what emerges out of these cafes are feelings of connection, spaciousness, relief. Often people begin sharing ideas for collaborative action, and yeah, sometimes we find room to laugh. And as we witness our own expanded tolerance for the scary and the uncertain, as we see and feel seen, we develop confidence to stay with the problem. This is precisely what clinicians mean when we talk about fostering resilience as we make our way through this uncharted territory. And finally, in this resilience, we can act with real intention, in collaboration, in small ways and big. We can make things move, inspired by what some call radical hope. As Sandra Lebowski writes, it is hope sustained not simply by sheer force of personal conviction or by willful ignorance of reality or because of a privileged immunity from reality's worst contingencies. It is secured in its roots by a metaphysics that affirms change and possibility, agency and power, novelty and creativity, and value and importance. And in this radical metaphysics, the first step is to bear witness and to break the silence.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Very, very worrying facts, very worrying statistics. But luckily, with events like this, we can ease the anxiety and try to change our future. So yeah, thank you very much for your very meaningful intervention. And I would now like to hand it over to Suzanne Moser. Suzanne is a climate change and social science researcher, and she will briefly discuss her background. She will add on to Rebecca's thoughts. Susie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Xavier, and for inviting me, to all of you for inviting me and to be part of this, and for so many of you to show up. It's just always really encouraging to me when there's 60 folks on a call like this. And I guess it just simply speaks to this enormous need that we all now feel of, you know, as Rebecca just said, of beginning to talk about our feelings about this issue, not just to try to understand it. Just by way of brief introduction, I studied climate change for a long time, the physical science, and then I got increasingly interested actually in how we humans deal with it, how we can respond to it, both on the front end of the problem, if you will, reducing the emissions that cause climate change, but increasingly to look at, you know, how do we prepare for and manage, navigate the world that is impacted by climate change. And I've been doing that for some 30 years, working in what we, you know, in terms of jargon call the adaptation field, and had a little bit of a hand here in the US to help shape that field as a profession. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I've learned in that context. But I want to launch into that by asking you all to, you know, you're in college right now, you're looking at your careers, where are you going to be headed? You know, whatever work you might be doing. I don't know, maybe it's something oriented like what Rebecca was just saying. Maybe you want to become therapists and want to include climate change in that. And thank you, Rebecca, for, you know, charting what a therapist in the climate change world could be like. Most therapists are not that yet, right? And so it's wonderful to hear this vision, if you will, of a climate aware therapist. But some of you might be going into environmental fields. You might be going into planning, into engineering. I don't know, whatever. Imagine that for a moment, whatever that is. Maybe some of it is directly oriented toward mitigating climate change or adapting to climate change in public health, natural resources. I don't know where you're going. If you will, please put it in the chat so we have a sense of where are you headed with this topic. I would love to know what your career hopes are. So just chat that while I'm talking. And as you're thinking about your ideal hope or your dream of where you're going, I can't think of any one career that will not be in one way or another impacted by climate change. You know, either because you're directly dealing with it or because climate change affects something that you do in the world. and you just have to deal with it, right? You have to adapt to this world. Now, imagine what would it be like to go to work every single day and look this reality of worsening climate change in the face every single day. It's your day job. You know, you cannot avoid it. It's just central to what you will do. Well, you know, are we going to continue to be in the silent mode that Rebecca described, or are we going to, how do we prepare for that? To look at this really dangerous and depressing reality in the face. Now, what I think the world, you know, if you wanted to describe this world that you're going to go into, I think there are three characteristics of that world that you somehow will have to deal with one way or another. One is that it's constantly changing. You know, we humans are sort of put together that we want things to be like yesterday. It's kind of how we're evolved, you know. Yes, we can obviously deal with novelty and create novelty, but ultimately we're creatures of habit. Our brains work that way. And now I'm telling you, it's going to change all the time. You know, when you think of, you know, I'm going to build my bridge because in a certain way, because that's how it worked yesterday. Well, think again. That bridge that you built yesterday may no longer be suitable for the future world, right? Or the way you did medicine, or the way you practice psychology for that matter. Nothing will be the same as yesterday. You have to constantly adapt. Something very uncomfortable, constant uncertainty, surprises, things you don't know how to deal with. What's the stance you have to have? What's the abilities, the skills to deal with a constantly changing world in which patterns are just not the kind of familiar thing anymore? The second kind of change that I think you're going to be increasingly dealing with is trauma, traumatic change, right? Because of all the disasters we're talking about. And that Rebecca already mentioned, especially if you're working with communities, in communities, it's the very communities that will be hit by hurricanes, by floods, by droughts, by wildfire, you name it. So somehow you have to be a trauma-informed work professional in whatever field you will be in. And then the third kind of change that I think we'll have to get ready for is transformative change. Because as we've already seen with, you know, COVID, it's racism and health and climate and economy and everything at once that's going to come together, and they're very systematically interlinked. And if we really want to make a difference, Band-Aids here and there won't help. We need to systemically change our communities in order to get to a livable world, a dignified world, an equitable world, an inclusive world. So constant change, traumatic change, and transformative change. And I want to ask you right now, how many of you are in this college program right now and feeling you're being prepared for those three kinds of change? I don't know, if we could do this, I would ask you to quickly flip on your cameras just to say yes, thumbs up or not. But my hunch is very few of you are being prepared as we speak. I know for a fact when I went to school, you know, the colleagues I work with, you don't learn how to deal with trauma in planning school. You don't learn how to deal with transformative change in engineering school. That's just not part of the curriculum, but we need that. That's the world we're heading into. And I give you an example. I guess I could use a Canadian example, but I don't know it as well as the California kind. So bear with me while I give you an example from there. But it was in the news all over. A few years ago, the town of Paradise in California was just, you know, wiped out by wildfire. Lots of people died, but it was essentially a town of some 10,000, 15,000 where 98% of all housing stock and all infrastructure was burnt, and everybody was displaced. There's, I think, now 3,000 people who have come back. But in that instance, the mayor and every single person on the city's board and every staff that the town have lost their houses too. So the very people that you depend on in your city to help you come back to on your feet, they had, you know, the children had no place to go to school. They had no place to sleep. They didn't know where their stuff was, right? So you're in the middle of a traumatic event and you're supposed to help your community. I think this is the kind of scenario that we will see, unfortunately, more and more of. And we're not currently preparing you all as you going into that profession to deal with it. This is something I worry about a lot. This is my climate anxiety, that we're essentially not prepared to deal with the kinds of challenges that are coming. So what do I do? How do I turn my worry into action? Well, one of the things I've been doing is now for 5-6 years, developing a project called The Adaptive Mind. And it is essentially focused on understanding what are the skills and capacities we need as individuals, as professionals, to deal with constant traumatic and transformative change. And then to develop training modules to essentially do, if you will, professional development after you all come out of school, to help you have the skills to essentially function in this world that we're now creating. And it's not just a matter of, personal well-being, your own sanity as you go forward. That's essential, right? You yourself have to deal with all that reality that's unfolding. But as a worker in the community, you will be asked to lead. You will be the ones who will help your community. And what are the skills you need in order to be that kind of leader? Someone who can, help people navigate this kind of world that we're creating. So it's something that I feel is really essential. It is a kind of leadership development, if you will, professional development, leadership development. And it really needs to integrate how we take care of ourselves in the midst of this kind of chaos and how we help others who are experiencing it through that. And so I guess I want to simply close with that and say it's an example of how I turned my own worry, if you will, into an action that hopefully helps some people. We're slowly getting the financial support for the project to actually really roll it out, but it's just an example of how you can make a difference in the world. And with that, I'll turn it to, I think, is it Laura who's going to go next, who's going to tell you a lot more about how to make change. So thank you all for being here and for listening. Laura.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susie. Very empowering words and very motivating for all of us who are still, trying to make something meaningful. And as you were saying, indeed, now I would like to introduce you all to Laura Sarta. She's a young Colombian activist, and she will be speaking to us from the international side, how youth people can do things, do actions to try to change this climate change anxiety into something meaningful. So welcome to this panel, Laura. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Javier, and thank you everyone that is here with us today. I'm very happy to be a part of this meeting. I sort of identify myself as an arts and climate organizer. I'm very interested in building bridges between sustainability and creativity. And so I'm the founding director of Global Warning Agency, a foundation with 12 years of operations here in Colombia, committed to climate action and youth empowerment with her headquarters here in Bogota. I also serve as a head of the curatorial section of the arts unit and other collections of set of museums here in Colombia. And I'm also a professor of a master's in cultural management of an university. So all of this is to say, to sum up, as one of my previous colleagues was saying, that there's usually a time where a lot of our different passions intertwine. And for me, that issue or that theme that has been like a common thread throughout my life has been the interest in sustainability and sustainable development and in climate action specifically. Through my work and the work that we do here in the foundation, sort of focusing on climate action and creative activism, We have been recognized as global change makers by the British Council, as climate champions and One Young World ambassadors, and have participated as panelists and guest speakers in different international events like the World Economic Forum, Civicus Youth and World Assembly, Global Power Shift, and TEDx Youth. And these have been venues or spaces to speak up from a youth perspective. I'm now 30 plus years old, but I started with this work when I was maybe 16 or 17 years old. And this is just to say that it's usually very common to undermine what youth can bring to the table, because we're told to wait until we graduate from school, to wait until we graduate from college, to wait until we have a master's degree, or we have like a proper work job, or any other sort of number of societal expectations on what we should be in order to have an agency to change and to promote lasting change in our communities. But through our work, we have proven that, and I'm sure with the work of many of our colleagues here and the people that have joined this conversation, we have proven that that is not the case, and that actually youth can bring a lot to the table, not as the future generation, but as the present generation that is having to deal with all of these issues as well, right? So I want to talk to you a little bit about GWA, or Global Warning Agency, and I'll try to share very briefly my screen with you. Oh, I think I need to.
Let me double check, Laura, if we can give you sharing privilege here. Our technical staff will help you with that.
But I can start in the meantime, no worries. I can start telling you about GWA. So it's called Global Warning Agency, and it's an organization. Oh, thank you. I think I just got my permission. Great. So GWA is an organization committed to sustainable and creative development here in Colombia, as I was telling you. And we started this project in 2007, 2008 in response to a crisis context, right? The foundation is now registered as a foundation since 2014, and we develop our activities in 3 different axes: education, research, and creation, to contribute to a collective construction and the creation of bridges between creative and cultural practices and the sustainability and climate action that we feel it's important to tackle in this climate emergency that we live in. So most of our projects work around action for the climate, or climate action, and the country's youth population. So these are some of the focuses of our work: resources, skills, and we use resources, skill, and inspiration to utilize arts into organizing and integrate it into the heart of climate organizing, different campaigns and mobilizations to strengthen movement building, innovative new forms of resistance, and add to positive change. We see arts as tools for social transformation and as mediums to raise awareness and move from the understanding of the climate crisis from an intellectual and academic understanding, which is very important, but also to an emotional and creative engagement and commitment, which for us leads to a climate action, because we not only understand it intellectually, but we're also moved to do something, right? So I know we've discussed this before, but the climate crisis is immense, and we must be daring and courageous in response. We embrace experiments and new solutions, and recognizing that this crisis requires innovative ways of solving problems is what drives us to look into different ways of creative activism. So this is what I was telling you about before. how many times we've heard all of these, youth are the future, or youth is the future of the planet, of the world, of companies, organizations, whatever. The difference between this present and future seems pretty obvious, but in reality, it means that we need to wait until we're wiser, more experienced, more objective, more rational, and stop being so impulsive or crazy or immature. However, this impulsiveness or this craziness or this lack of experience with how things have been for many years allow us to create different ways of looking at things. And these allow us to use our time more wisely in order to put our agency into building a better world. So these are some photos from when we started our actual project at school. I think Javier recognizes some people in the photos from back then. But right now we are a registered organization that focuses in those 3 areas. So these are some of the photos of the projects that we've created with different urban and rural youth here in Colombia, building bridges between sustainability and creativity towards climate action. These are some photos and stills of different documentaries that we have developed with various communities between Colombia and Venezuela in South America, as well as these ones. And I just wanted to sort of finalize, because I know I may be speaking a little bit more than I had planned, about this quote that I read recently about Olafur Eliasson, this very famous contemporary artist speaking with Kumi Naidoo, who is an activist and former head of Amnesty International and Greenpeace as well. And they were talking about how artists and activists find ways of contributing to coming up with a transitional scheme for how to tackle the climate crisis, and how activism is fundamentally an act of hope, because it's about human beings saying, sort of, we refuse to accept that the world that we live in is the best that humanity can create for itself and for other species and living beings in our planet, and that we can build societies that secure the existence of human beings, but not in the way that we need to destroy the planet in the process, right? To destroy biodiversity in the process, which all things, ironically, are needed for human beings to survive. And so I would just encourage you guys to think about, we know this crisis, it's enormous. We know that we're not going to make the crisis go away, but that we need to work towards a transition scheme of how to slow it down and how to adapt ourselves to this new world, right? And I think activism and art, from my perspective, without trying to generalize too much, are trying to make things visible, things that are uncomfortable, things that are difficult to deal with, and they both can serve the purpose of making visible to the largest amount of people on the planet what we're trying to tackle, right? To draw attention and bring some visibility to things that are happening that are wrong in our planet. And sometimes, unless we're able to elevate this visibility of several issues that are unfair and unjust and that are happening in the world, then it's very difficult for other people to know what to do about it. And visibility is usually that step to expose those issues. So in order to move from climate anxiety to climate action, I would encourage you guys to think about that idea of hope. Usually we think of hope as sort of, we're hopeful and then we act because we're hopeful, but there isn't hope if there's not action. So I would encourage you also to to think about what acts you can maybe take in your daily lives and collectively to, on one hand, bring visibility to these issues, draw attention to all of these issues, and also to remain hopeful for yourselves, your mental health and the health of your communities, so that we can be stronger together into tackling this issue from all different types of perspectives, both professional, regional, right, gender-wise, with different racial perspectives as well, because as we were mentioning before, these are all intertwined, and I think it's not going to get easier, but if we think of this as an issue that we need to tackle together, maybe we can find hope into bringing out collective change through that creative perspective. So with that, I think I'm going to finish up, and here are some of our contact details in case you want to carry on with the conversation later.
Thank you very much, Laura. That's kind of a hopeful message, and kind of also eases this anxiety that through action we can have hope of a better planet. And to keep going and continuing with activism, now we want to localize this message into Toronto with our next speaker. I would like to introduce you guys to Eleanor Rougeau. She is from Environmental Defense Canada. She's also an activist. So welcome to this panel, Eleanor, and please feel at home and tell us about activism in Canada and how someone from France turns to become a great activist in the country.
Thank you very much. Bonjour tout le monde. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I know you've just heard a lot of words and a lot of information thrown at you. So I'll try to keep this as useful in terms of your next steps as possible. As Javier mentioned, I work with Environmental Defense Canada. I'm a program manager there, and I focus on campaigns that are around climate and energy. So things like, how do we transition workers to a clean future? How do we clean up after industry? Really those concrete questions around the environment. And I'm also a youth climate activist. So before actually getting a job in doing this, I was organizing the Fridays for Future Toronto movement. So that's the youth climate strikes. And I was just wondering, maybe in the chat, if you wanted to put a little plus sign or a little, just your name, maybe if you have attended one of the youth climate strikes, whether it's in Toronto, the GTA, or anywhere else. Great to know Rebecca has been there. It's always good to know who has actually experienced the energy of those climate strikes. So today I'm hoping to speak about the how do you start, because I think what we've heard is climate anxiety is super valid. It's actually something a lot of us feel, and I can testify to that too. And one of the strong remedies is stepping into action. But that's easier said than done. And you might be thinking, great, so what do I do? What do I do? I just like go outside and start my own protest right now. And you certainly could, but I don't think that's the best way for you to get started. So try to provide a bit of guidance. And the way I'm gonna do that is actually share how I got to activism, not because I think I'm fantastic and amazing, but because I think that it's really helpful to see how like I had no clue I was stepping in that direction when I started. It was truly a kid that was concerned, and then I got to doing this work full time. And then I'll try to give you a few groups and names of groups so that you can kind of like look them up and get involved if you want. So my personal story of activism is really the step-by-step one, where when I was a kid, I really just started learning about the issues and pretty rapidly getting anxious about the issues, to be honest, but also just, concerned, pretty angry as well. I don't know if it's because I was from a country, I'm from France, where we usually kind of voice our angers pretty quickly, but really rapidly, I was like, we have to do something about this. And so I joined, movements within my schools and then within my community. And eventually I started joining larger movements. And so throughout those like years of middle school and then high school, I just kind of took on slowly more and more leadership roles. But because they were still, within either my school or my town or within, a regional thing, I also didn't have the like amount of exposure that you might have later on. I didn't have TVs inviting me on. I didn't have like huge panels. And that also allowed me to gain confidence in the fact that I was allowed to voice my opinions, but I also had to be informed about them. And so it's actually when I was doing work in south of France on the refugee rights movement that I first really heard about climate change, I guess in a way that alarmed me. Like before I had heard about it, but I thought it was like an environmental problem. I was like, oh, that's sad for the animals, which it is sad, but it just didn't get me angry enough. But then when I heard about the fact that it was actually going to make the refugee crisis that I was already fighting and outraged about so much worse, that's when it became so real for me. That's when I was like, that's a human crisis, right? That's something that's going to impact our entire lives. And if I'm lucky that it's not going to impact me, then it's going to impact the folks that I'm trying to help right now. And so that's when I really felt compelled to act. And I did what a lot of people do. I tried to change my lifestyle. So I changed my diet. I was freaking out every time I used like a piece of plastic. I was trying to convince my parents that we could not fly for Christmas because flying is really bad. And I became, like super obsessed with my own carbon footprint. And that, as you can imagine, didn't make me feel much better. It just made me feel much worse. And so I calmed down on these. I still watch my diet. I still don't buy fast fashion. I still don't do some things, but I also allow myself to still live. And I'm not completely feeling bad about myself every time I do need to get coffee somewhere. Instead, I started trying to organize, and I started trying to organize on my campus. And when I did that, I realized that we needed to kind of focus our attention, not so much on, again, those small tweaks. Like at first I was like, let's just get compost bins in the residence on campus. And again, it just felt so frustrating. It didn't actually feel helpful because I was just spending hours and hours trying to tweak some small things. And meanwhile, like a new government got elected in Ontario and fully reversed every environmental progress that could have been made. And so again, that's when I really thought, okay, how do I use my skills, the things I like to do, to kind of change things on a more systemic level? And that's actually the moment where I started to feel good in activism. That's when I started to actually like want to do more of it. And I like fully, sacrificed a lot of my university years where instead of doing more of the stereotypical university stuff, I was organizing a lot of the times. I was organizing strikes and rallies and movements, but it didn't feel like a sacrifice because I had kind of found the type of activism that actually helped me address my climate anxiety, my fears, my guilt of contributing to the destruction of the planet, And then to kind of finish this off, so once I started organizing, for me, it was in the youth climate strike movement, because for me, it made sense to just, the role was like speaking to a bunch of other youth and telling them, we're going to mobilize on this day, and this is how, and this is why. And I'm someone that really likes to connect with others. So that's what I ended up choosing as a path. But then there was kind of a final piece, is that while I was on university campus, activism was always a side thing, right? And that can still create a bit of a frustration, especially when your main courses are quite the opposite. And I'm not going to make you guess what I was studying, but I was studying economics at a pretty traditional university called the University of Toronto. I'm not afraid to say it at all. And so studying economics felt like I was actually studying the status quo while trying to fight it. And it was just really frustrating. So instead of going to the career that I thought I wanted initially of giving a try to private sector or elements like that, I just started looking for jobs that would make me do full-time advocacy, speaking out, bringing people in, translating knowledge into things that people can understand and act on. And that's when I decided to work for environmental defense. So I started over the summer. And what I do is exactly that, is I read reports, I try to become an expert on a topic, and then I speak to media and to people. and to elected officials and people in government, because you might think elected officials are experts on topics, but they have decisions to make on many topics. And so they're not at all experts on them. So you kind of need people to bring them the knowledge. And so all of that little pretty long story actually is to say that my life was identifying that I wanted to act on an issue, really like processing the fact that I cared and I felt bad when I didn't act on it, and then figuring out my skills, my interests, and like my favorite way of doing it to actually pursue it. You know, and that kind of leads me into what I'm hoping you folks can take from this is the idea that you have a role to play in the movement. You fit in this movement, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that you get invited in by a group and you have to fit what they want you to do. It's way more about figuring out what your strengths are, what your interests are, and then kind of bringing that to the broader movement. So I'll just try to give, I guess, maybe like 3 pathways you could take. The first one is joining an existing group. And when you join them, expressing what you know how to do. I assume a lot of you are really good at anything comms related, whether it's writing up things or whether it's finding good messaging or it's producing assets to go with something. Well, we need a lot of those. A lot of this is a communications battle, honestly, unfortunately. And so at groups like Fridays for Future Toronto, we're always looking for youth that can provide those skills. And then in a professional setting, a lot of the large nonprofits, including environmental defense, have entire communications departments, not just policy experts. So really, you know, one way to get involved is actually just making your career or your free time available to the movement. A second option is if you are not ready to dedicate a huge part of your life to this yet, and that's totally understandable. You have other things you have to deal with. Maybe you have other causes you care about. Maybe you have personal things you need to address first in your day. And so I want to give you a few areas that actually allow you to be kind of a supporter, but in a way that actually changes things. I'll give you the example of what we do at Environmental Defense, but I know that other orgs do it. It's just to share what I actually know. We have supporters that are people that sign up as if you sign up for a newsletter, but instead of just getting sent articles or fun videos to watch, you get sent actions, calls to actions, and the actions are maybe a prompt for you to write a letter about a specific issue that we explain first to an elected official. Or sometimes they're a little step further there, you click and it automatically rings you to the elected official, and then you actually speak to the issue. And so that demands less time for you because you don't have to follow every day the policy development, but that actually makes a difference because I've been told that when an elected official gets between like 30 to 50 calls on an issue, which is not huge, we're probably almost at the number right now, 30 to 50 calls, that changes the urgency with which they will treat the action, because not a lot of people do that. Not a lot of people will call someone in government to tell them. And then another way is for more of the youth groups, Fridays for Future Toronto, there's a few others, Climate Justice Toronto. They want more like physical presence. So maybe you can't organize, but you can show up. And so those are also ways to be like in supportive roles, but committing to showing up next time there's an action kind of thing. And then other groups that have other like variations of supportive roles. I know that Indigenous Climate Action has some for our kids. So that's an organization mostly done by parents. They have calls to action like this. Artists for Real Climate Action, that's if you want more of the artist side. These are all groups that have a presence in the GTA. So I'm talking about as local as possible for you here, and that can use your support. And the third one, and then I'll stop, I promise, is that you can mobilize and organize within your own network or community without creating you don't have to create a nonprofit, you don't have to create a charity, you don't have to go that far. And that's actually, and there has been research showing that it's really peer-to-peer education that helps change people's opinions on some topics, so when you speak to your peers, whether it's your colleagues or people from a same hobby group or a same faith-based group, it doesn't have to have anything to do initially with the environment. When you start talking to them about the actions you're taking, the groups you're supporting, the event you're going to attend in solidarity with, the youth striking for climate, for example, you're actually doing a lot of necessary work that I can't do because I'm not trusted in your community, but you are. And so that's really something I encourage you to consider, is kind of playing that bridging role between the community that trusts you and then the community that is, might say, like directly being active. And I'm sure that when doing that, it would also allow you to release some of that climate anxiety, because you actually get to voice your concerns to people around you. And you might hear, oh yeah, I'm also concerned. When you start talking to classmates, sometimes it ends up being like, yeah, I'm also concerned. I've had that experience with a lot of young women that were in my classes, where it came out through the idea of parenthood. That's how it first came out, is, yeah, I'm concerned because I don't imagine having kids after this. That's how it started. And then you bring them in the movement, or you bring them in action. So that's kind of the pieces I wanted to say, keeping in mind that you don't have to be a climate scientist or an expert to be active in this file. I'm so far from a scientist, and yet I've learned a lot of science actually through this, but I've mostly had an impact by just voicing my concern and then pointing to the science. Please ask for help, reach out to activists. Like, we constantly want to bring you in, but we also don't want to harass you. So reach out to us and we'll bring you in and we'll invite you. And then know that you're allowed to find the activism that makes you happy. If you don't like standing with a megaphone in front of Parliament, you don't have to do that. We need people that are creative. We need people that are good writers. We need people that are good caretakers. So find your role within it. You don't have to fit into what you're seeing on TV of the megaphone holding activists. So yeah, thanks so much for your time. And for those of you that have your cameras on, for your smiles and nodding heads, I appreciated that. And if we have time, looking forward to questions. If not, have a great evening.
Thank you very much, Ali. Thank you. Very nice perspectives. And I really, really like to thank you all, our speakers, for sharing the knowledge, how to change this anxiety into action, into hope, as we've seen with Laura, into meaningful things, into activism. And now I would like to open the floor for any questions that you may have. Feel free to raise up your hands or to pop the questions on the chat, and our speakers will be able to solve them. I know Rebecca has informed me she's got a appointment in a few minutes, but for the time she's here, she will be able to answer a couple of questions. So I see Seamus' hands up. So yeah, go ahead, please.
Sorry, the video won't let me put up my own, like the Zoom hand. I just had a question about, when is the appropriate time to start having conversations with youth about climate change? Because I get the sense it's becoming more common now in like high schools and whatnot, but I don't remember it being a large question during my time in high school. And not that I consider myself a youth or anything, but it's just, is it starting to pick up? Is there more of a vocal, or is there more teachers? Is there more of a curriculum for it now? That's questions to anyone, by the way.
Okay, who would like to take on that from our panel?
I'm happy to start, but I'm sure others can, yeah, Rebecca can add to it. So my sense about it is there probably is already a need for it if you're beginning to just hear about it now. And the reason I say that is for exactly the reason that Rebecca mentioned earlier, that, you know, there's such a pervasive silence. So many of us are concerned, but we're kind of daring not to talk about it. It's like so unpopular to do that and be the doomster in the room, right? So I think if you simply start the conversation, or you offer yourself as someone who's willing to hear it and listen to it, you create basically, if you will, a new social norm that it's okay to talk about it. By you talking about it, then that gives permission to others. And you'll very quickly find lots of people will knock on your door and say, can I talk to you about this? I tell you, it's exactly how it works in my professional field, that people just, know me as someone that they can talk to. And I then have people come into me. It's like, I am so depressed about this. How do you deal with it? And off we go, right? So it's just opening a space for it, and then people come.
Thank you, Susie. Rebecca, you want to add on to this? You're muted.
I think like any important social issue, there's really no too early of a time. I think that we talk about it in age-appropriate ways, and we talk about it in ways that children can feel as if they are being heard and have ways of engaging the question in their own way. I think the problem is that so many people are surrounded by pretty extraordinary news without a whole lot of concrete ways of understanding it, talking about it, forums. And so they're left with the anxiety, but no actual places to put it. And so I think in the schools, there are growing curriculums happening in the schools, but not nearly enough, because school administrators are also kind of scared to talk about it, or have all sorts of regulations within their schools about what curriculum can be addressed. And so these are all points of contestation, honestly, and places where, if people are wanting to get active, places to get active. Have it discussed in elementary schools, and having kids start raising issues about food and food sourcing in their elementary schools. There's really no shortage of opportunities to connect information with their own activity, which is what people have been talking about. The concern I have, again, is that if those conversations happen only with action, 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 we're missing also talking to kids about how they feel on these questions. And parents lose the chance to be able to connect with them on those questions. And that is a larger and important part of this all, so that they not only stay engaged for a moment, but they can also start feeling capable of taking on the question for the longer haul.
Thank you, Rebecca. Ali, would you like to add on that as well?
Just a 30-second addition, but I think Rebecca summed it up in a good way. I've been trying to tell parents that this is like the equivalent of sex ed, but for climate, is that kids already hear about it. And if you don't talk to them about it, they'll Google it and it'll be much worse. It's like, for me, it's really the same idea. And so, yeah, addressing it early on, age appropriate way. And ideally, if it's possible, to bring them in through youth produced content, at least for like maybe high schoolers. I don't know how much, youth can know how to speak to very young folks. Like, I don't feel qualified, but I feel quite qualified because I'm still relatively close to high school age to speak to high schoolers about it. And so sometimes it's also an easier way to have the conversation, education by peers.
Great insights. Thank you, Eleanor. So we have another question from Amin Wally. I can't see her surname, but anyway, for you, Ali, which political parties are working with environmental defense, and is volunteering with a political party? And is volunteering with a political party a good idea and way to promote political willingness to fight climate change?
That's an excellent question. So actually, environmental defense, because we are a charity, we have to remain nonpartisan. And we actually also continue to choose doing so because we firmly believe that climate change shouldn't be a partisan issue. Now, mind you, in many debates and cases, it becomes one, but it shouldn't be. And so we've really tried to remain nonpartisan. So we work at both the provincial and the federal level with any political party that will engage with us. And we'll push the same solutions and the same questions, and then whoever takes it up are the ones who take it up. To answer you on your second question, I think more than which party you would want to volunteer with, I found it useful to look at which candidate, because first of all, for you, it'll make more sense to look at candidates more locally and and at the levels that speak to you most, but also because you can have what the parties do, but then it's important to have anyways people that understand the science and are committed to dealing with the emergency. I guess like no matter the color of the banners they have. And so I'd say if you're able to, before different elections, look into the candidates in your riding or riding nearby, and look at which one you feel speaks more, like is more committed to the truth, understands the science, is really willing to act on the emergency, is courageous and honest, then I'd say that's a good use of your time, is really looking at the candidate level. Or that's kind of my preferred one, is actually not doing like a per candidate or per party tactic, and instead pushing all parties to raise ambition, pushing journalists to ask the right questions, making sure that the media asks at debates the questions that really should be posed. So not like, is climate change real, but how are you dealing with climate change, for example? You know, those kind of framings. I've personally found those to be, I guess, the ones that I felt more appropriate to kind of engage in, if that answers your question, yeah.
Thank you, Ali. Laura has informed me she's got a meeting coming up. She's actually a bit late, so I wanted to thank her for being here with us. Thank you very much, Laura. We really appreciate the time and the work you are doing in Colombia to help fight climate change and climate anxiety. Thank you very much. Bye. So we have another question from Donna. She's actually the programs coordinator for this program from corporate communications and public relations at Centennial College. And she asks what corporations are doing a good job in this area. And, oh, I lost the question here. And are activists willing to work with business on purpose-driven campaigns? I'm not sure who probably you, Ali, or Rebecca, Susie.
Could you repeat the question? I'm not sure I fully got it.
Sure. What corporations are doing a good job in this area of climate change and climate anxiety? And if are activists willing to work with businesses on purpose-driven campaigns? Probably that is more for Ali. But if you want to take on that as well, please do.
No, if others want to give that a try, I think it's a complex question because in principle, again, I'd work with anyone that has decision-making power and wants to do something. But often we have to ask ourselves, at least for me, I've had to ask myself, like, is my time worth it? Is engaging in 50 board meetings with large companies who say they care, but then don't actually act on the presentation I give them worth it compared to engaging with those who might care more? So that's kind of the approach I've taken. I'm really not like against the idea of working with businesses and corporations. They actually are the ones from whom most of the emissions come from. So we do have to have them actually change their attitudes. But for me, it's really like it's pretty much on a case-by-case basis. It's, are you actually asking me to come speak to you, or are you willing to engage with me because you care or because your website needs an update with a youth activist on it? And so that's kind of been my experience. Yeah, but I will say, if folks that are more on the corporate side want to start making up good and at least national, maybe supranational standards on how we could actually assess a company's willingness, true willingness to be better for the world, it would be useful. There's a lot of criteria out there that are, I'd say, not so helpful. Yeah.
Thank you, Ali. And probably, I'm not sure if Rebecca or Susie would like to answer also the first bit, which corporations are doing a good job at this?
I can't speak to specific organizations or corporations, but I can, in terms of a perspective, is think about also the workers within organizations, whether they're unionized or not, is that so often when we think about economic incentives, we're thinking about economic and profit motive incentives of corporations, but also the people who are scared of losing their jobs, the people for whom these are identity questions and financial questions and taking care of their family questions, that I think engaging unions to talk a little bit more about sort of how to protect their livelihoods in the context of a transitioning economy is so important, which is part of why the Green New Deal in the United States was so important. But I think when we think about economic framing, I don't think we should only focus on corporate profit, but also the people who are standing to lose in the sort of immediate transitional economy, and how we can make ways for them to survive and take care of their families as their own way of life is shifting.
I think just to add to this, I think there are, for me, it falls really along a spectrum from, people who are purely just greenwashing, corporations that are just greenwashing, to organizations that are trying to build an entirely different economic model of how we interact with the environment and with each other. And everything in between. I think good lists to start is to look at, who has divested from fossil fuels, who has, if it's among energy companies, who has basically stopped building coal plants, shuttered the coal plants, who who is disavowing fossil fuel. Those are good places to start. In my own field, in the adaptation field, I see a lot of companies now coming into the fold, for one thing, because they see a profit opportunity to get into the consulting and the, servicing around helping communities build, different kind of infrastructure, finance their projects in a different way. But there are others that are simply afraid for their own operations, right? It's through the vein of supply chain management or protecting the workers, picking up on what Rebecca just said, that they get really worried that climate change is affecting their own operation and their own ability to survive as a company. And so it's worth looking into that in more detail and not just sort of, take the first layer of whatever you find on their website. But if you're interested in interviewing them and really preparing a bunch of good questions to ask them about this. I know from people who work in the government and nonprofit worlds who wanted to shift or look for a different job, most of the job openings right now are in the private sector for people who are doing exactly what I just described, moving in that direction. So the community is waking up to it, the corporate community, that this is where the world is headed, but along a spectrum.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you, Rebecca. I think we have time for one final question. It's quite a long question, but I'm going to summarize it in going to try to do it in a short sentence. And what would you say will be a good approach to convincing skeptics using an economic framing to disregard climate change?
Okay, I've spent much of my career working on this kind of communication, and quite frankly, I've given up on this approach to it. So this is not, if you try to message a skeptic in whatever framing, I just say, give it up, don't do it. It just doesn't go. Shut up and listen. What are their concerns? What are their interests? How do they want to be good citizens in the world? How do they, what's the legacy they want to leave, and start from there. So not you talking at them, but listening to them, asking them really curious questions, and see if you can get into an interesting conversation. Don't try messaging.
Interesting. I'm not sure if Rebecca or Ali would like to add to that as well.
Ali, do you want to add to that? I don't have the experience that Susie has, and so I have not gotten exhausted by trying that that strategy, but I am moved again by other approaches that really try to talk to what people do care about, that we start with the assumption that everyone cares about something. And as people say, every single thing in life is going to be affected by climate change, and we need to find what it is that they care about and try to connect with that. One thing that Katharine Hayhoe did say, and Susie, I don't know if you'd agree with this, is that you don't try to convince anybody that you can't also personally relate to at some level. That you need to be able to identify with some part of them that you feel like you can connect to. And in that process, share values and then talk about its connection to climate change. We have to start realizing that people will approach these issues from a lot of different places and will have different priorities. All we care about is that we get to the same place at this point. And so she, in her book, Saving Us, I think it's called, Katharine, she gave this example about going into a room full of fossil fuel executives. And she was like, how in the heck am I going to be able to relate to these people? And she said, she dug deep, and then she finally realized, I'm grateful that they existed because they freed my mother from labor in the kitchen by having technology to get my mother out of the kitchen and able to do other productive work. And she said, there was a stage where I found myself grateful that they existed. And she was able to go in with that perspective and then say, we now need to transition. And she found she didn't win the room entirely, but she opened the road to a conversation. And I think that's what we always want to do, is we want to keep the conversation going and moving and not shut it down. At least with people who are not deniers. You know, deniers is probably not worth it.
I think that it really speaks to why it's important to at least start with your own community, your own peers, the folks that see the connection relatively early on. And then, yes, once you get to the point of being someone like Katharine Hayhoe and folks that are kind of sent to speak to the hardest ones to convince. But that's why for those of us, it's so important to start with the people that could already relate to you, so you don't have to do that digging too much. I'll say also, I see a little risk with the economic angle. And I'll say that because I have a training in economics. And so often people were like, what's the business case? What's the economic case? What's the investor case to solve this crisis? Whether it was houselessness, climate crisis, refugee crisis. And I realized that I'm really afraid that if we just find the little trick to make it work, to make the economic case for it, whether it's pricing the thing that's negative, whether it's, if we just find the little economic nudge, economic trick, then I'm scared that my kids will then have to, deal with another huge crisis, because instead of speaking to people's values, people's humanities, instead of getting us to correct our systems, we just found a little trick every time in the economy. And so the next generation has the next huge crisis to deal with. And that kind of segues into, John, I see your comments about TikTok and tech tools. And I will just say, I am a young person that uses social media and technology, but please do not think for a second that those large tech companies are the ones that are also going to save us, because for the climate crisis that we have right now, our digital rights crisis is the next one. And so let's be very cautious on giving them too much credit for what they can help us do here.
Thank you very much, Ali, Rebecca, Susie. So I think with this, we can wrap up. I know our guest speakers have a very, very busy schedule. So it's time to wrap up, despite we really want to get this probably another hour. So I really want to thank our guest speakers again, Rebecca, Suzanne, Ali, and Laura. I would also like to thank our sponsors, Environmental Defense, Climate Psychology Alliance North America, and Global Warming Agency, for helping us get the message of this event across the world, basically. And thank you for all of you in the audience for coming on, for being here, for taking the time to learn a bit more about climate change, climate anxiety. We hope you have learned, as we all have, and that you feel in a better place to cope with climate anxiety. There's a link, we've added a link, a short feedback survey in the chat. So if you like, please take a couple of minutes to fill it out and let us know let us know what you thought of our event. Don't worry if you can't fill it right away. We will also be emailing it to you after this event. So this is a wrap up. Thank you very much and have a great, great night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.